The Scott Pilgrim comic sucks.
No, it doesn't.
Alright, it doesn't. But I remember as a kid kind of finding it fairly underwhelming. Having seen the movie first, I thought the comic was gonna be just like the movie. A fun romp with a bunch of gags and a spectacle of fights. Instead, I got a story that seemed more concerned with the relationships than it is with the fights. Ramona, Knives Kim, and Envy have a bit more limelight in fleshing their personalities, and my younger self thought, this is kinda boring. Like, what do you mean I have to listen to a bunch of girls talk about their feelings? That's dumb. I just want to see some cool fights and see more of Wallace. So besides the enjoyment I got reading the source material of a movie I enjoyed, I only liked bits and pieces of the comic. So I can't say I loved the comic the same way I did the movie. It was charming, kind of funny, with really cute art, but I didn't really care for the relationship stuff, which was like the entire focus of the story. Now, as an adult, I love stories about relationships, romance, and all of its complexities. My favorite movie of last year was the slow romantic drama, something my younger self would probably fall asleep to. And in watching Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, I was surprised by how much they fleshed out the exes. Turns out they're people with proper personalities and backstories. They're not just cartoon villains, and I love that. And while the show's fight scenes were fantastically animated and fun, my favorite parts of the show is when it focused on its relationships, which made me want to revisit the comic. Having matured with a greater interest in relationship stuff, maybe I'd finally enjoy the comic for what it is, instead of being bummed out for expecting something it wasn't. And the result? The comic is better than I remembered, but not as good as I hoped. As an amalgamation of melodramatic romantic dramedies with coming-of-age and shonen manga elements, it hits home runs in some ways, but majorly fumbles in others. And I think this is because of how the comic mishandles its premise. Where the show excels in marrying its 7 evil exes action concept with introspective character exploration, the comic struggles to juggle these two ideas in the air without getting distracted, tone-deaf, or being anticlimactic. So let's dive deep into this, as I attempt to explain to you where I think the comic falters and where the show improves upon it. And in order to explain that, I need to talk about what Scott Pilgrim is trying to achieve.
To defeat 7 evil exes.
No, I mean narratively. What is Scott Pilgrim trying to achieve narratively? According to Brian Lee O'Malley, he didn't really know what he wanted out of Scott, at least initially. He just wanted to make a comic that his friends would enjoy, since his previous work was a bit too moody for them. So now we've got this video gamey premise that somewhat acts as O'Malley's wish fulfillment story, taking aspects of his life, then making an alternate version of it where things are a bit weirder, starring a shonen protagonist. Simple-minded, kinda stupid, you know, that archetype. So Scott Pilgrim has the building blocks of something simple and fun. Slay the dragon, save the princess, beat the exes, get the girl. But the story isn't as simple as that. O'Malley mentions here that he wanted to undercut the premise immediately, where the story becomes less about the evil exes and more centered around its romantic elements, which is probably the reason why my younger self found it, kinda underwhelming. Isn't the movie a romantic comedy drama as well? It is, but the movie's handling of the drama aspect wasn't a strong focus as it is in the comic. As you progress through the comic, the series becomes a more deliberate focus on Scott's exes, with O'Malley describing it like a soap opera, a descriptor he shared with the manga Nana, one of Scott's inspirations. So with this video game shonen framing setup where Scott is a wish fulfillment character, the comic's narrative is all about dismantling Scott's perception of himself and seeing the root cause of his issues as the world changes around him. To quote O'Malley, "I don't think Scott is an asshole. I think he's a fool. The story is about how you can unintentionally do harm. You don't have to be a full-time asshole to be someone who can do harm to other people." So this is what Scott Pilgrim ends up being, a man-child realizing that he's hurt a lot of people by running away from his problems when things get a bit too complicated or troublesome. A real Simon Pegg Edgar Wright story, if you ask me. And the Netflix series pretty much achieves this. In order to find out who killed Scott, Ramona has to literally confront her past and then realizes the unintentional harm she's done to her evil exes. Ramona has undeniably hurt people, but she does her best to make amends. Whereas the comic achieves this in a more clunky fashion. It's complicated because the comic does feature some highlights that are absent in both adaptations. But I think the most obvious place to start as to where the comic is much worse than the series are the exes. As stated before, O'Malley undercuts the premise of the series entirely and makes the shonen vibe take an immediate step back. What I thought would be a tournament arc-paced narrative takes a more relaxed approach. By volume 4, Scott's been dating Ramona for 4 months, and it took 2 months for the next ex to even show up. And hey, that's fine. I actually kinda prefer it now as an adult. I don't really care about grand fights with rules upon rules of stuff to keep track of. That's just white noise to me. I adore something like Pluto, where discussion takes priority over their fights. And it's not uncommon for writers to switch up their plans for whatever reason to huge success. And with O'Malley admitting that he's not really interested in fights, how did these fights with Ramona's exes turn out? Often anticlimactic, which provided us with Lucas skateboarding to his own death and the vegan police stopping Todd. And I don't use anticlimactic as a bad thing too, since this is how O'Malley describes these fights. And hey, a good anticlimax can be pretty effective. So what's my problem with the exes? As far as my preferences go, I like it when fight scenes tend to be emblematic of something. A battle of philosophies. Fight scenes in narratives aren't just random encounters in an RPG to bloat out the experience. They tend to say something and develop a character to highlight a character's state of mind and their development in the story. Whether it be fights or moments evocative of a fight, fights are expressions for the story's themes. And for the most part, the comic's fights aren't all that great in doing that. Like, these fights don't reveal newer and deeper layers of Ramona's mysterious life, nor are their backstories unique enough to stand out from each other beyond their superficial aspects. They are just villain of the week characters that feel interchangeable with one another that all express the same shade of Ramona was a crappy girlfriend, when ideally, each potential pairing should explore something new about our main character and their love interest. And if being a bad girlfriend just ends up having her victims become dimensionless characters that are similar to one another, it makes Ramona's character feel weak in addressing the story's themes.
But what about Scott? If they don't say anything about Ramona, surely they say something about Scott, right?
I mean, not really. Much like Ramona, each ex feels redundant in their reflection, with the only highlight being Gideon, because otherwise, nothing specific about these exes says anything unique about Scott. Even if we get a parallel between Todd and Scott, both of whom cheated on their girlfriends, the story doesn't take the opportunity to highlight this parallel. And maybe that's the point of the story, right? Scott not realizing the parallels because he's an unaware fool, which is a character trait that can work brilliantly. But in Scott's case, it isn't all that great. While he does recognize how similar he is to Gideon, his lack of self-awareness up until then ends up feeling more frustrating than interesting. So these fights end up feeling inconsequential to the plot, where the exes feel more like a distraction from the actual interesting stuff going on in the story, instead of like complementing it. This is why I like Takes Off more than the comic, since Ramona's journey is intertwined with her growth, while we discover new things about her exes. Turns out, Lucas was genuinely heartbroken about Ramona leaving him, as the show treats it with gravity instead of a joke. And the reason he is a cocky evil ex who wanted to be the best at everything is because of Ramona's negligence of his feelings. Oh, and he's not even evil, he's just a dick.
You willfully chose to join a league of evil exes. I need to know how evil you really are.
Ha! We're not really evil. It's just branding.
What was just a passing phase for Ramona was an important relationship to Roxy, and you felt that emotion in the fight. It's like musical theater. When emotions are too strong for words, you sing and dance. And in the realm of action, when emotions are too strong for words, you fight. And I didn't feel that in the comic. Roxy's fight just feels like she's kinda pissed.
I don't hit girls! You think that gives you the moral high ground?
Sorta.
Well, it doesn't.
You're just a pussy, Pilgrim!
She expresses the same amount of frustration as every other ex, so there's not much to her as a character. Which is fine if the priority is spectacle and fun, but not so much when you're trying to flesh out your characters. And it's not just me who thinks Roxy is underwritten, O'Malley thought this in retrospect as well. Whereas in the show, you feel Roxy's heartache. This fight illustrates her unresolved emotional baggage caused by Ramona, and that's great. I love it.
I was too afraid to face you.
So you left without a word? You made me feel like nothing!
We even learned some stuff from the less heartfelt episodes with the exes. Todd isn't hung up on Ramona, much like the comic, but Todd thinking he found true love, only for it to be squashed and then be led on, is a light, fun way to explore the story's themes, while differentiating himself from the other exes. Instead of being just another asshole, he's a heartbroken mess, which is how comical a melodramatic one-sided relationship can kinda look like. And Patel isn't the first ex-pipsqueak everyone thought he was, which leads him to succeeding Gideon's company, making Gideon, who's actually Gordon, to end up with Julie, which Ramona questions because of how toxic he was.
When I was with him, Gordon, was a twitchy, rage-filled, impulsive, emotionally abusive, controlling, manipulative egomaniac. But if he makes you happy, that's good, I guess.
Be back in a bit, baby!
Okay, bye, I'll miss you!
This is what I like. They don't feel as interchangeable as they did in the comic. Each ex says something about themselves or Ramona, or affects a plot in a way that's unique to them. Whereas these dimensionless comic exes could have swapped places and none of it would be all that different. Todd and Lucas could have swapped places. Roxy could have been the first ex. Or Patel could have kidnapped Kim. So by not using these fights to their full potential, they feel awkwardly attached to the narrative. A distraction from what I genuinely find interesting in the story. They're just dimensionless villains with anticlimactic fights. And dimensionless villains would be fine if the story just wanted to be this fun and simple thing. And this is where the movie succeeds by not undercutting the premise, but by embracing it. By turning the fights into a spectacle, and by borrowing the visual language of comic books and video games, the action becomes campy, creative, and fun. Absolute eye candy that's unrivaled by even today's live-action standards, and it achieves this by being a fun and simple movie. But the comic is trying to say something more that the feature-length movie couldn't. So while the exes ended up feeling like one-dimensional characters that don't have the amped-up charm of the movies, less time with them means we have more time with our other characters. This is where I enjoy the comic quite a bit, surpassing the movie and even the show in some ways. So what was left out of both adaptations that I quite enjoyed? Let's begin with Knives Chow. Much like the movie, she complains about her situation to Tamara, and then blames Ramona for the situation. But then we have moments like this brief scene in Volume 3, where Scott and Knives have a chance to talk about their breakup. And as the comics go on, we see her find other ways to cope with her breakup that makes her out to be more than just a crazy ex-girlfriend like she is in the movie. So she gets a chance to be a bit more introspective.
You can't still be pining over him.
I'm not. It's just, when he's with her, he seems so happy. When will I be that happy?
Then we've got Kim, whose vulnerability is completely lost in the movie, where her sarcasm embodies most of her character outside of like literally 2 scenes. Whereas comic Kim can be a bit more open, even insecure, like when Scott mentions playing for Envy in this scene.
That's bad news? That's great news!
Your ex-girlfriend?
We're gonna open for them? They're known!
Yeah, at least, pal.
We could get known!
I saw her on the cover of Now.
I've seen all my favorite bands play there!
I used to see a lot of shows there.
She's pretty.
She's also more lively at times, seeming to enjoy Ramona's company and a high school friend that she hasn't seen in a while. She also takes more initiative to keep Scott on the straight and narrow, and is clearly torn between her feelings for Scott while knowing Scott is destined to be with Ramona. Like this scene here, where Kim is kidnapped by the twins and Scott attempts to rescue her. But Scott is losing the fight despite Kim's desperate screams for Scott to save her. But the thing that finally kicks Scott back into gear, despite being on the verge of giving up, is what Kim yells here.
Scott! I got a text! It's from Ramona! She She can't wait for you to come home. She believes in you. She just wanted to make sure you're all right. I mean, against the twins, and I'm typing back. Come on! He's Scott Pilgrim!
This is my favorite Kim moment, because she knows she's not enough to fuel this knucklehead spirit. While this moment characterizes Scott's love for Ramona and shocking the twins' perception of her.
Impossible! Ramona
Can change? Oh, shit!
KO!
It's a heartbreaking setup that leads nicely into the truth, where Ramona leaves Scott by the end of the volume. That's great writing. And finally, my favorite thing about the comic that is completely absent in the movie or series, Lisa.
Scott Pilgrim?
It is you! Ah! Oh my god, what are you doing here? Oh, I can't believe this!
Hi! Yeah, what's up?
It's Lisa! Lisa Miller from high school, remember?
To catch you up, Lisa is a friend of Scott and Kim way back from high school. She's the bubbliest character of the cast, who's also a conventionally attractive, excitable blonde that attracts the male gaze. Scott's gaze included.
Honestly, I'm only here to get out of the heat, but I don't think I can stay long. The place is full of slutty teenagers.
Yeah, slutty.
But nothing has ever happened between her and Scott, since Scott was with Kim at the time. But Lisa's appearance and her attitude towards Scott makes Ramona skeptical, and the sexual tension between Scott and Lisa gets confronted. Which is fair to question, because Lisa admits to liking Scott's attention.
So all my regular clothes were in the wash. I was wearing that stupid little dress and all tarted up as kind of a joke, but you couldn't take your eyes off of me, and I liked it, okay?
You mean you've been dressing in an unusually sexy fashion because of me?
Yeah, I guess that's what I mean.
That's amazing!
She even puts on this specific nightgown after Lisa heard about Scott having nowhere to stay for the night. And the spiciest it gets between the two is the moment Scott mentions his fight with Ramona.
Did you win?
Not really. It was about you.
The fight?
She thinks we have a thing, or had a thing, or something, but we never did. Right?
Maybe we should have. Maybe we should.
But thankfully, nothing happens. According to Lisa, Scott pushes her away and starts babbling on about how much he loves Ramona. And look at that. The L word. This scene shows that his feelings for Ramona are actually genuine, unlike his emotional rebound of a relationship with knives. Which leads to Scott finally saying the L word to Ramona for the first time.
Oh, damn it!
And when it comes to melodramatic relationship stuff, this is the sort of thing I'm looking for, you know? Just a domino effect of stuff affecting each other and causing a ruckus. Lisa's a test of Scott's love and Ramona's trust, and I enjoyed that. This is actually the first time in the comic where I felt something was at stake, and I wish the comic gave me more of this. Because, to be honest, the comic's relationship drama felt underwhelming at times. Remember when I said O'Malley didn't really know what he wanted out of the comic in the beginning? I think the comic doesn't really find its footing till around volume 3, but most definitely by volume 4. Because up until then, the comic seemed more concerned with being this fun toy box of ideas. A song you can play to? Cool. A section where you can cook stuff? Sweet. That one scene from SpongeBob? Sure, why not? Which is fine if you want to be a quirky little series all the way through, but the pivot towards the serious relationship stuff made the comic feel like it was spreading itself thin, making the relationship aspect of the comic feel pretty underwhelming to me. And take note I say underwhelming instead of bad, because the story does hit all the beats I want it to hit. But it just doesn't scratch that romantic drama itch perfectly. And truthfully, it's stories like these where it isn't obviously bad or good is where I feel kinda stumped. But I'll attempt to explain my slight indifference towards the narrative. And I think this indifference stems from the drama failing to interrogate the cast's feelings, failing to expose the depth and characterization the story could have achieved but rarely does. When it does it right, you have great moments like this predicament with Lisa. I like these moments because it gives opportunities to explore some heightened feelings and heightened emotions, which I assume is O'Malley's goal if he's gonna describe his comic as a soap opera. And that label holds true when he hits those overly dramatic beats. But at other times, I feel like certain setups aren't utilized all that well. While I initially praised Knives' handling, I wish we saw her interact more with other characters. Like, we never see Knives actually talk to young Neil about anything, let alone Scott. I'm surprised we don't see her squeezing more information out of Scott's friends in general. That seems like a great opportunity for characterization for someone so desperate. Knives doesn't even attempt to approach Kim, another ex of Scott's. It would be neat if Knives and Kim could connect over Scott's treatment of their relationships, both the good and the bad, similar to what Kim and Ramona did in the show. I know Kim mentions that she doesn't like opening up, but Knives pestering her could have been a thing. With O'Malley mentioning Kim's loneliness being a weak plot point, this could have been an avenue to flesh that out. They even drunkenly make out in Volume 4. That seems like a great starting point to have two victims of Scott's romantic negligence and their feelings to be confronted. But that doesn't happen. Getting drunk and trauma bonding after spilling out some heavy stuff happens to emotional people when they get a bit tipsy, and things that shouldn't happen. Now, I don't want any romance between the two or even a budding friendship, but just for them to connect over a shared crappy experience and reflect on it. Imagine the drama out of that, for this moment to be treated with weight. Now, while the series doesn't have them discuss such heavy topics, they do something pretty clever with the pair. Instead of not interacting at all, Kim asks Knives to play music with her, as she probably notices Knives isn't feeling all that great. So she encourages her to play, after leading in with this line.
Drumming's a great outlet for my emotions. Rage, mostly.
And from here, Knives and Kim share a moment, and they end up enjoying each other's time. It was a really cute scene, exactly the type of interaction I was looking for. A scene where Kim comforts Knives. But the biggest reason why I like this is because Knives has now a new outlet that gives her time to focus on something other than Scott. And we know this because she isn't wearing Scott's jacket anymore after this scene. Now, while the emotional wound is still present, that wound is given closure once the jacket is given back when she confronts Scott. Pretty good detail. Now compare this to comic Knives, who does all sorts of things, but mostly gets over her feelings by letting time pass. By volume 6, she's ready to move on, especially since she's moving away when she graduates high school. While figuring out one's feelings by letting time pass isn't inherently a bad narrative decision, I prefer Knives' agency in the show, since she feels less like a character who exists solely for Scott. Hence this kiss. It wasn't there to explore Kim or Knives as characters, it was just there to blow people's minds. So yeah, the show is a massive improvement over this, especially when the show's kiss was weaved in better.
No sparks.
Worth a shot.
What about your hot coworker? Is she coming back?
Okay.
Oh, and while we're on Roxy, let's talk about her and Ramona.
What's going on, Rami? I'm trying to sleep up in here.
Staying with you?
You guys ready to break up yet, or?
Oh god.
After Scott beats Roxy, Ramona mentions that she didn't even make out with Roxy all that much. Since Ramona was suspicious of Scott hooking up with Lisa, it seems like Ramona thought it was fair game to hook up with Roxy, even though nothing happened between Scott and Lisa. This seems like a really good opportunity to explore some relationship drama. But O'Malley said he put that in because he thought it was funny. This is incredibly tone-deaf, considering cheating has always been met with criticism throughout the comic. So the comic's unwillingness to question this makes Ramona not just nearly characterless, but unlikable, and not in an interesting way. And while we're on Ramona, why doesn't Ramona ask more about Knives? She does question Scott in this one panel, but that's basically it. She says she likes hearing about bad stuff about exes in Volume 3, so the fact Ramona doesn't dig deeper into Scott about why he dated such a young girl so briefly that's head over heels for him, I don't know, it feels like a missed opportunity. It'd be a way to ease in and justify her suspicions about Scott for being so evasive before her blow up in Volume 4 with Lisa. She immediately questioned Scott about Lisa when she first appeared, so why isn't she curious about knives? She hangs out with the group, attacked Ramona in Volume 2, and kinda wears her feelings on her sleeve. So why doesn't Ramona question Scott about any of this? And back to Kim, actually let's save that for later, but for now, let's take a step back and look at what I've said. Maybe I'm asking too much in this story. Logistically, this man can only draw so much, and I'd rather him not overwork himself to death. And the story could go on forever, but O'Malley had something definitive in mind. Whatever the reason, the end result has me finding these combinations of characters kinda uninteresting, since they don't push their personalities and narrative themes to the limit. This fun chart here alludes to some complexity in their relationships, right? But there really isn't. The relationships are fairly simplistic, and there's little to no overlap of characters doing stuff with each other unless Scott is present. Things are happening in the background beyond Scott's presence, but it's not really interesting. When I watch something like Nana, one of Scott Pilgrim's inspirations, you can feel the limits being pushed with these characters. I feel like the story explores every possible relationship dynamic and explores it to insane lengths. We have Hachinana think, why not Yasu? Why not Nobu? Why not Takumi? How the hell did it end up like this? Why am I feeling these strange things about Nana? Why do I feel like crap knowing Yasu went out with Reira? Why do I feel like crap knowing Nana is spending more time with Ren? Heed my warning though, Nana is very, very flawed. When it's good, it's really good. When it's bad, boy howdy, you wish you didn't read the manga. I will say this though. Nana is at its best when it dives into every nook and cranny of every possible feeling of every character, interrogating each thought that leads to stupid shenanigans, which includes getting different points of views and opinions of the same situation, often hopping away from our main character. Whereas with Scott Pilgrim, I'm underwhelmed. While we are reading a story about the effects of being an unaware dude that unintentionally inflicts harm, I feel like we don't get enough of other characters' perspectives and feelings and how they deal with that harm. The comic at least gives us some scenes with knives as we occasionally switch to her perspective, but other characters barely get these moments of characterization, if at all. So we only ever get to witness their pain and grief whenever they explain it to Scott, as if their existence as characters only matters when Scott is present. And I'd like to see more scenes without Scott, where the cast gets a chance to explore their feelings. In fact, only 10% of the book involves scenes that don't have Scott present, which leads to the story underdeveloping its supporting characters, failing to build upon its great setups. We want a story about the unintentional harm Scott does, but we still want to make him likable, so we're not gonna dive too deeply into it. And that's what the story feels like to me, like it's too scared to really shine a light on its women and how they've dealt with Scott's treatment, which makes the relationship stuff in the comic very shallow and uninteresting to me, which I'll talk about soon. But whatever, maybe if O'Malley had infinite time, he might have gotten around to, covering this sort of stuff in the comic. But for what it is now, the characters feel fairly lackluster. Scott Pilgrim fails to be a go-to when I'm craving for some interpersonal relationship drama. Whereas Takes Off elevates these characters to something more memorable to me. Again, the fact that these characters are a little bit more intertwined with each other when their stories don't feel like separate bits is when the narrative feels greater than the sum of its parts. While the comic gives us a bit of Ramona and Wallace, Ramona and Stacy, or Ramona and Kim, really mostly Ramona hang out with other people, it seems like Gordon with Lucas, Wallace and Todd, Knives with Steven that stick out to me, because these pairs explored the story's themes that the comic never got around to touching. It also helps that they're just genuinely fun combinations of personalities to put together, way better than the ones in the comic. Unless you're telling me Steven and Joseph were a standout pair. And these interactions are elevated for me because of what these scenes are in service to. It's in service of Ramona and as she confronts the mistakes of her past, as opposed to Scott, who feels kinda one note. Like, I don't find Scott's character study of a man-child protagonist all that interesting. As someone who adores Edgar Wright's work, my favorite movies of his are explorations of these men who refuse to grow up. And while I think his Scott Pilgrim adaptation is his weakest man-child film from a thematic narrative standpoint, it didn't bother me all that much because it wasn't trying to be anything deeper. While things are hinted at,
I don't want you scaring off the coolest girl at my party, Scott. We all know you're a total lady killer wannabe jerky jerk.
It's completely untrue.
That time with Lisa?
That was a misunderstanding.
That time with Holly?
That wasn't what it looked like.
That time you dumped Kim?
Okay, me and Kim are all good now, all right?
relationships are simplified to maintain narrative focus. At its core, it's a simple slay the dragon save the princess narrative, whereas the comic is attempting to be a little bit more than that, as O'Malley mentions that the story is deceptively deep. At least deeper than his initial desire to just have a fun comic that his friends would enjoy. And while deep is a nebulous and subjective term, I don't find Scott Pilgrim all that deep. I wouldn't even call my favorite Edgar Wright film deep either, but it's really effective in illustrating its point. Whereas the Scott Pilgrim comic illustrates its point fine enough. The comic feels like a mixture of stuff that works in some ways but falters in others, a symptom of being this toy box of ideas. So you'll have ideas that could grow into something deeper, like Knives and Kim becoming closer, Ramona being on good terms with an ex, or Envy's side of the story. But those things don't bloom into anything. Or sometimes the story will introduce something that seems pretty cool at the moment, but retroactively kind of harms the story for me. On a smaller scale, you have Knives' dad being a consequence for Scott's treatment towards Knives. Cool, but this ends up eating time we spend with Ramona and Roxy, contributing to their underwritten relationship. But on a larger scale, we have this moment with Scott and Kim, where we find out that Scott is an unreliable narrator, as he often warps or forgets his painful memories in order to stay comfortable and simple.
We were high school sweethearts, but I had to move away. It wasn't my fault.
You're moving to Toronto.
Are you kidding? You didn't even tell me you were leaving. I heard it from Lisa. I didn't talk to her for a month after that.
You're moving to Toronto?
This is why Scott spends the first half of this volume retreating to the previous women in his life. Kim in particular is described as uncomplicated, hence this kiss.
No, Scott!
What?
We can't.
This is in line with him being a simple character, and his desire to remain simple and uncomplicated is an issue Kim raises up. So Scott warping his memory feels clever because it makes sense. Cool twist. But that brings Scott's memories of Envy into question. If Scott is prone to paint himself in a better light, I'd like to know the truth of how he broke up with Envy. How is this moment meaningful if we don't know the full extent of how much Scott screwed up? How is this moment meaningful if we don't know what Envy really felt in this moment? I already know that Scott is a jerk, the comic says as much, so this reveal shows Scott doesn't want to take any responsibility for the breakup by falsifying his memories and villainizing Envy. Which leads us to find out Envy wasn't the sole reason the relationship ended, which means she isn't just a mega bitch, she's actually a person. And that's interesting. I want to know more about Envy's feelings and her perspective on what it was like dating Scott. This is the thing that interests me most about their relationship, and we don't even get it. I thought Ramona was supposed to be the mysterious one. Why is Envy as mysterious as Ramona? Because think about it. What do we really know about her? There were some good times, as Envy says here, so what went wrong? Did she really cheat on Scott? She seems like a hopeless romantic, so I would have loved to know how she genuinely felt about Scott and how he hurt her. Was she sympathetic, regretful, frustrated with Scott? Was he just another boy to dull the pain while waiting for Todd? Or was he someone she might have loved more than Todd but left because she was scared to confront those feelings? I don't know. I don't know anything about Envy, so why should I care about her closure? And I get O'Malley wanted it to keep it ambiguous, but I just don't find her interesting. She's not a character, she's just a plot device for Scott. And overall, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't really care about comic Scott, because the story hasn't given me a reason to care. And in romances, I end up caring for these relationships because I get to understand the characters' feelings for their love interests. Whether it be wholesome or downright toxic, seeing how a character justifies their love is a crucial part of romances for me. And with Scott, I don't really know why girls like him. and if I do know the reason, it feels kinda bland to me. At worst, he's an archetypical blockhead shonen protagonist with a harem of women who like him for increasingly uninteresting reasons when you realize how similar they are to one another. Golden Boy justifies its harem better than Scott Pilgrim.
This is so educational!
Liking a dude for being simple and attractive is fine, but Scott needs to have meant something to them to get me invested in their relationships. Like, why is Kim so hung up about Scott if he beat up her high school boyfriend for no good reason? If Kim is going poor Simon Lee, how'd she go from there to liking Scott? Was this kiss after the fight even real? And there may be a lot of answers to these particular questions. Complicated feelings that lead to convoluted destinations are all fair in love and war. That's what romances are all about. But with Scott Pilgrim, I don't really understand why Kim still likes Scott. What's so great about Scott that you were willing to forgive him for beating up your inoffensive boyfriend at the time? Why do you even beat him up in the first place? Why do you still pine for him? Because you were high school sweethearts? Being the high school sweetheart is just an archetype, not a reason substantive enough for me to care about this pairing. I can understand why Ramona and Knives like Scott, but Kim, Lisa, and Envy just seem to like Scott for some reason. Their payoffs are good, but their simplistic characterization makes their love seem thoughtless and shallow. Besides Knives, we're so stuck in Scott's perspective that we don't get many moments seeing how these other girls really feel about Scott, which should affect how we feel about Scott. But since we barely get that, the comic feels more interested in redeeming Scott than it is in exploring the feelings of these women as people. So as someone interested in the romantic aspect of the comics, I'm starving for reasons why someone like Kim still likes Scott. If the story is about exploring and figuring out these love interests, as O'Malley mentions here, then it has failed because I don't know much about Kim. That's why I like how the show presents Kim and Scott's relationship. Instead of Scott's warped memories, it shows how Kim feels about him and the good she's done for her. While their relationship is simplified, the simplification was necessary to make Kim's fondness of Scott believable. Whereas the comic's twist complicates Kim's feelings, which is fine to do, just as long as the comic takes the time to explore those complicated feelings. But I feel like it failed to do that. I wish her insecurity was explored a bit more, or at least her life outside the group like this mini-comic over here. Why doesn't she connect with Knives? Is Kim looking for love? What about Scott was so different after being with Envy? What was Kim's relationship with Jason like? Remember this character? The guy Kim was dating and then cheated on her with Holly? It gives us this pretty good scene and leads to some awkward romantic tension, but all of this is in service for Scott, with none of it used to explore Kim as a character. So how did Kim really feel about Jason? What are the depths of Kim's romantic feelings? I don't know. Who knows? I want to know more about Kim. I want to know more about Knives, Envy, Ramona, her exes, because I want to know how everyone has dealt with their broken hearts and how that defines them as characters. This is what the story is about, right? And we do get there sometimes, but it's not enough for me to be hooked by their grief and their actions. Because the stronger the grief, the stronger the pain we see our victims feel. And when we explore that pain, the worse it makes our culprit look, which makes their attempt to make amends and achieve closure more impressive. And if you're trying to tell a story about the harms of being an unaware fool, then you gotta sell me on how awful Scott and Ramona's negligence affected their exes. While Ramona's exes are uninteresting and fail to do that, Scott's exes have something a bit more going on. But it just doesn't take full advantage of the setups it made for itself. And that sums up my frustration with the comics. It's a collection of stuff that lacks the runway for most of its ideas to get off the ground. In attempting to do a lot, the whole fails to be as good as its individual highlights. And while I wouldn't call Scott Pilgrim a bad story, I would call it an unpolished one. And when you do polish it and, get its priorities straight, you get the movie and the show. By simplifying its relationships and adhering more closely to the 7 evil exes premise, you get the movie. There's no need to explore the layers of Kim and Envy's relationship because the movie doesn't plant these expectations. And the movie's expectation is a light-hearted romantic comedy with flashy visuals, and it does so perfectly. By focusing more on Ramona and her relationship with her exes, we get the TV show, which was what the comic was basically trying to go for, a deceptively deep story that takes full advantage of its larger-than-life surreal concept. And look, we take a lot of time outside of our protagonist's perspective in order to flesh out other characters in the story. Isn't that great? And I love this series for delivering on what the movie and comic couldn't, solving problems in interesting ways. Scott and Ramona's relationship might come across hollow and very manic pixie, but introducing sparks is a fun way to let a couple know something's up. It's a great way to motivate someone to find out why there were sparks in the first place.
You like him, don't you?
There were sparks.
And I think that's smart. And I like that the villain of the show is Future Scott from the comic. His arc in the comic boils down to him recognizing that he hasn't been all that great. He and Ramona are now self-aware and aim to better themselves for the future now they've recognized their faults. And it works much better than the one in the movie. That ending sucks, which I've already talked about in this video if you want to know why. And since Comic Scott's arc is merely recognition and not changing drastically by the end of the story, Takes Off plays with the idea of Scott not really changing, so he ends up doing the same thing he's always done. He avoids his problems and distracts himself when things get difficult, which parallels nicely with Ramona's actions, essentially having the same realization as Scott did in the comic. So that's a fantastic tie-in too. But despite my preferences for these adaptations, I will say there are still things about the comic I do miss. Like Lisa. I felt like she was the one used most adequately, since she introduced some interesting conflicts, and I had no questions about her by the time she left the story. Sure, she just so happened to like Scott like every other girl in the comic, but at least that's all she needed to be. While I love that the show borrows the movie's interpretations of the characters, we end up losing some of the grounded romance of the comic. I wonder what Envy would have been like if she was played more naturally and less like a diva. I wonder what Kim would have been like if she was performed with the warmth we see in the comic. And what if Knives' boy craziness was toned down a bit, but she was still struggling with her feelings for Scott. And the only ex that achieves what I want narratively is Gideon, a villain that says something about Scott and Ramona. And the comics are the only place we see Ramona working through her mixed feelings for Gideon. While I wish we got to see the specifics of Gideon's emotional manipulation and how Ramona fell so hard for him, I'm glad that we get to see a representation of Ramona's complicated feelings. And this is what I mean about wanting to see a character deal with their feelings. Give me more of this. So while it's great that Ramona has worked through her emotions in the show, which suits the adaptation, I think Ramona's defiance against Gideon is one of the better moments in the comic.
You know, you're right. Part of me does still belong to you. But the other parts of me... finished with you! Get out of my head!
It's a great ending to the comic, much better than the movie. And to flip it around and toss some shots at the show, I do find it a bit odd that they show Gordon in the end amongst the other exes here. It seems like out of all the exes, he's the only one who seemed genuinely bad for Ramona. Sometimes the cure to loving your abusive partner is to leave them. Some people are just terrible people to be in a relationship with, and no amount of waiting and second chances are gonna fix them. So Gordon isn't a love that Ramona shouldn't feel bad for leaving at all. Her love was merely misplaced, which makes this well-earned ending montage a bit tainted. Let's see here. Some of the comedic pacing and line delivery feels awkward at times. Like, awkward, not funny awkward. And the animation just doesn't match the performance sometimes.
You broke my boyfriend! Prepare to die!
Crash, boys. Either way, they probably cancel because they think we suck.
We probably do.
That's not funny, Kim.
What about Ramona Flowers?
You know her? Tell me now.
She just moved here, got a job at Amazon, comes into my work.
Does she really?
Didn't you say she just broke up with someone?
Did she really?
That, huge fight or whatever?
Did they really?
Yes, but I didn't want Scott to know that, Steven.
Yeah, I don't know what it is about that girl.
Scott, I forbid you from hitting on Ramona, even if you haven't had a real girlfriend in over a year.
Hey, what?
Ramona Flowers.
Ramona.
She's from New York City.
The Big Apple.
She moved here after a bad breakup.
She's single?
Got a job delivering DVDs for Netflix.
DVDs for Netflix.
I'm like her only friend in town.
She needs friends.
I forbid you from dating her, Scott Pilgrim!
And I could go on and on with nitpicks, but truthfully, I'm struggling to find any real issues I have with the show, since it's pretty much what I wanted out of the comic. And while it would have been neat to get a direct adaptation of the Scott Pilgrim comic with my favorite anime studio, and while there are things I do miss and even prefer in the comics, I think this new story is better as a complete package. And if Scott's story were to be adapted, I think significant changes would have been needed anyway to be anywhere near as good as Takes Off. And if it was adapted beat for beat, I feel like I can find the story's fractured ideas best handled elsewhere. If I wanted a surreal slice-of-life experience of dudes just hanging out, we've got stuff like The Regular Show or Atlanta that deliver that vibe. If you want a story about flawed, unreliable narrators avoiding their issues and recognizing their faults, Fleabag and 500 Days of Summer are right there. And Beef is a fantastic character study of genuinely awful people who are unaware of the extent of the harm they've caused. Also, an anime with video game influences is an oversaturated concept. I haven't seen all that much, so look to other channels who are more knowledgeable than me in that regard. Lisa's story? Past lives. Melodramatic relationships? Nana. Unaware fools? The Curse. A cringy concept with video game aesthetics featuring a genuinely terrible guy?
My life is like a video game.
Defeating 7 evil exes in order to date a girl with surreal video game inspired elements with an emphasis on recognizing your own autopilot behavior that's hurting people? Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. And while I do understand people's frustration with the bait and switch, I like the bait and switch. I think it works. It stays true to how O'Malley undercut the premise of his comic immediately. That's so in character. Also, I just prefer something new over the familiar. I even had a tweet asking for something like this months before the show even came out. That's just my bias, and I'm glad it came out better than I expected. Anyway, I hope this video doesn't come off as me thinking O'Malley was an idiot with a golden goose idea, like it was only improved when it was in the hands of others. If anything, I'm showing you how much he's improved as a writer by praising this Netflix adaptation. Unlike the movie, where he didn't really have a hand at the script besides being a consultant, he's a co-showrunner and a co-writer of the series. And as O'Malley recognizes the faults in his old story, he not only ends up refining Scott Pilgrim, but making it feel more novel for fans like me with this rug pull. And it worked. This is just the advantage of looking back at your old work with new eyes and a co-writer, and seeing where you can twist some things. Instead of just figuring things out as you go along, you get to see everything in its entirety and reshape it into something more refined, really selling the message of Scott Pilgrim with novelty. And that's worth celebrating, especially when the series is one big love letter to the fans.
Sparks are real?
When they started playing Anamanaguchi's soundtrack from the game and then referenced the barrier in Volume 1, while Knives' highlights get knocked off, I don't know, it was just pretty neat. I just love that attention to detail. Look how unobtrusively the show parallels the comic. It's great. And so, to get the most out of the show, maybe you should read the comics as well. Despite my complaints, people, still wholeheartedly love this thing. Even my friend Anna, who I made the Scott Pilgrim video with, it likes the comic more than the movie, so friggin' what do I know, right? So if you're a fan of the movie and show, but still haven't gotten around to the comic because, you're undecided if you want to commit to it, it's fairly short, so sure, I'd recommend it, totally. I think you would enjoy it. So yeah, that's Scott Pilgrim. I think it's fine, but I think its adaptations are way better. All thanks to discarding the comic's underdeveloped ideas and remixing what's left to be used with more narrative purpose. So, if you want the best animated show of last year that features fantastic animation, memorable music, and a great exploration of flawed characters with a lot of novelty, check out Scavenger's Reign. Genuinely one of the best shows of last year, so you better go watch it right now because boy howdy, I want a second season. Oh, and yeah, overall, takes off, pretty good show. Exactly what I wanted. Sweet. Did you enjoy the art from the video? I made them, and as a huge Scott Pilgrim fan, they were fun to make. If you'd like to support me and get some cute wallpapers for your phone, you can buy them down in the description, or join my Patreon and download all of my previous wallpapers as well from these other videos, and you know, get some extra stuff on the side. So if you'd like to support me in a world where AI is pretty much devaluing the craft of making art, throwing money my way is always appreciated, and it helps out a lot. But of course, just watching my videos is more than enough. Alright, cool. Time for the Patreon shoutouts.
Thank you to my patrons. Hey, bingo. Kelly Quinquist, Locke, João Vitor Gombrea Gomez Rodriguez, Francisco Romero, Tailored Muffin, Yumi, Dan Brown, Kay. What? Ratlong, RQ52, Bad Randy, Enormous 98, Keo, Seti, Trevor Hoppin, Parker Murphy, Taboo TV Cat, Gob, Tootbot, PS1 Hagrid, K-Cuber, oh you better not do that, Great Sage, Skylar, Sailor Dog, King Zentair, Shailing, Invoyel, Axon 8,
Sand Gall, Kiss 6,
Psycho Groove 77, Soner B.